Okay. Now let's just wait until we get an okay sign from Jelena.
I'll just go check the actual sheet.
Absolutely.
And we will be okay. It should be already online.
Is this microphone okay?
Yes, it seems working.
Okay.
Okay. Lovely. Okay, so it's time for the next talk today, and we have with us every day.
Thank you. Thanks, Conrad. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to begin by slightly apologizing and giving an explanation. I'm sorry I haven't been here the whole time. Yesterday I went and had a rest. I have a pesky health issue called multiple sclerosis, and it does affect how I walk, hence my dislike of walking at night on snow and ice. But also I fatigue quite easily, so I'm very sorry that I have kind of, darted in and out. It's not all bad. In fact, it gave me a good intro into a great piece of research about healing. People try to heal me quite a lot, apparently, because it's seen as, sometimes for Christians, it's seen as a challenge. Anyway, so I will continue today now with my presentation. And thank you very much for inviting me. Nice to meet you all. Nice to see you again, Jonathan, who invited me to Coventry some years ago. I'm not, as you may guess, a quantitative sociologist and nor am I a psychologist. So I found this really interesting, giving me lots of background, giving me ideas. I'll weave a few through as I go, and hope then we can have an interesting discussion to look at this in a, I'd say, more sociological, perhaps a little bit of anthropological aspect. So my biography, I teach at Goldsmiths, University of London in sociology. This rather grand title, Race, Faith and Culture, is really because we didn't really want to say religion. A lot of sociologists get nervous around that word. A lot of them because they thought it was all over in the 1960s with secularization. A lot of them also figured that maybe religion might mean I'm trying to convert them or something. So I do have courses now in religion, I have to say. But race, faith and culture is sort of the spanning, really, what I do. A little plug for the Centre for the Study of Religion and Society at the University of Victoria in Canada, who do some fantastic work in contemporary religion. And so that's me. I teach in sociology of religion, critical criminology, culture and society, and more recently in diversity and decolonization. So asked today to talk about qualitative research in terms of researching the supernatural. I won't go into a great detailed explanation of what I mean by qualitative research. I'll weave it through the discussion. But I think Jim Spickard's view here is really quite helpful. He talks about sociologists being interested in either being generalizers or particularizers. And I think that's where qualitative research really has been, particularly within the anthropology of religion, looking at what specific groups do or think, and trying not to prove things, trying not to start with a hypothesis, trying not to look for truth, but look for how different groups may produce their own truths and meaning. So he talks about going away from the facts and looking more towards texts and discourses and narratives, and reflexivity, pluralism and dialogue. And I particularly like this last sentence, that it broods over the impossibility of its knowledge and the inadequacy of its key ideas. So all up for grabs in many ways in qualitative research, but nonetheless we do, as I've heard over the last 2 days, you do as well, try to find some kind of conceptual framework, try to find some kind of definition. I'm not going to start really, and didn't start my research with a definition. I was fairly Weberian in that, because I gather Max Weber also didn't start his research with definitions of religion. I particularly like Weber. I mean, he's all over the place, I know, theoretically, but one of the reasons I like him is because when I go to some particular conferences and people talk about research, and they always tend to ask a qualitative researcher, particularly if their bent is much more for broad statistics. They'll say things like, yeah, okay, so how many interviews did you do? Immediately, of course, we feel, unimportant to say something like 20 or 30 or 50. Then I always remind them, if they didn't know already, everybody seems to respect Max Weber. They quote him a lot. So how many interviews did Max Weber do? Actually, he did 3, 2 of whom were his cousins. Okay, so also, I'm going to situate this also within one of the very strong moves within sociology today and sociology of religion to decolonize the curriculum. And this is more than adding people to reading lists. It's very much talking about the kinds of theories that produce what we're doing. As Jonathan was talking about yesterday, about the theory-laden notion of measurement. Well, theory-laden notion of most of our concepts. And the thing about decolonization that I think is really important is that in not doing it, in not listening to other voices, we really impoverish our study. I was particularly struck by this when it became very obvious to me within teaching and research that really most of the time we're working with a very narrow set of perspectives and interests. And I know that's been somewhat crudely reduced to white men of the global north, but it is something worth questioning how much of what we are providing knowledge about is actually a certain kind of knowledge that is produced and disseminated in a certain way through teaching and research, and being conscious of that as our context. Because I think it matters. It matters certainly in the study of religion and the supernatural. I came across this originally with Fiona Bowie, who mentioned about this, I think a really important point. A lot of what we understand about religion lies that they're contextual and that they vary over time and place. But it's everywhere, and I think we therefore have to consider what we do with this, where we say that people might believe in something to do with the supernatural. I'm one of these really annoying people that take pictures all the time of something that interests me. So we see believe everywhere. We see the Starbucks believes that their Via tastes as delicious. They believe that. What do they mean by belief? What does Marks and Spencer mean by belief when they say they believe in sustainable fishing? Hook, line, and sinker. What do they mean by that? What does Sky Television mean when they say in football terms that they have 50 million believers? Are they saying Christians? No, they're not saying that. They're saying something else, believing in the possibility that England might win. Well, that's a belief. Aspirational belief. Sky also tells us to believe in better. What does that mean? In Macy's in New York, they just want us to believe. What does that mean? Bernardo's, a children's charity, wants us to believe in children. What does that mean? Well, I don't think it means believe that, does it? They're not saying, let's believe that children exist. Of course children exist. What are they saying in believing in? What they're saying is have faith in children. It's a little like something, you know, if you're trying to struggle with something and somebody says to you, oh, you know, you can do it, I believe in you. What are they saying? They're not saying I believe that you exist. They're saying I have faith in your ability. And that's very important when we come to looking at studying the supernatural. What do people believe in rather than what do they believe that? Oh, and Sony, they just want us to make believe. Okay, so this is the question. What do we mean by belief in the supernatural? Opens up all sorts of definitional issues. So I just started a lot of my research by simply asking people, what do you believe in? Because what I was trying to do was, at the time, I was trying to figure out, and this was back in when I did my PhD, 2002 to 2006. What I was trying to figure out was why was it when the UK census asked a question about what is your religion, why was it that 72% of the people who answered that said Christian? Why was that in an apparently secular country? So I had to figure out a way to ask that question. And the opening question, what do you believe in, was really intended to make sure that I could quite out some people. Because in some of my questions when I talked about these people who were very religious would say so very quickly. So this is my first opening about qualitative research and telling you about some of the methods. And of course, there are other important quantitative issues. And I've looked at a lot of them over the years. And what do we find when we think about the supernatural? Well, what we find, and people like Pew and other people look in their surveys, and they find this. They find that younger people are less religious today than the older people. And my recent research on baby boomers will also tell you this. Okay, so the millennials are less religious, but what do we mean by this? They believe in heaven. And just over half believe in hell. What are we to make of this? Back when I first started doing this research, I was curious in Haraldson's 2006 study drawing on European Value Survey, where he talked about, in Nordic countries, people believe in life after death. Nordic countries are generally presented as fairly secular. So what are all these people doing believing in life after death? So my take from these surveys is that there is a widely held belief in something after death. That conventional religious words like ghosts or heaven or hell or reincarnation are inadequate. I don't think those show us what people mean by that. And very importantly, the people who have those beliefs are both religious and non-religious. And in my own smaller scale qualitative research, I would find this. That many people, I would say, by kind of bringing them all together, believe in the continuity of the human soul. That is what most people talked about when I discussed with them these sorts of beliefs. They didn't really often talk about ghosts, occasionally, but most of the time. They were talking about people they knew. So, this belief in the human soul. Do we call that supernatural? Well, I think, again, we're going to struggle with that, what we mean by that term. But I do think, other than heaven, hell, or ghosts, that most people I have interviewed, and when I look at the surveys, I think what they're really talking about is a continuity of the human soul. Just a quick overview. I've been doing this sort of research since 2003. By now, I think I've got around 350 people who have participated in my research. I try to keep the age range quite broad. I think 14 to 89 is about what it is at the moment. Fairly evenly male-female, fairly even socioeconomic balance, mostly in the UK and some Canada, because there's some comparable religious landscape statistics and ways of research there that are very comparable with the UK. And what I found in general was pretty well unproblematic, interesting but unproblematic. Religious identifications complement other social and emotional experiences of relatedness. I think most anthropologists would go around with that. But I did this, and the thing that is maybe controversial is that I did the research by asking non-religious questions. So thinking about yesterday's discussion as well, which questions do you ask? I tried to ask questions that were not religious in order to find out about religion. I didn't want to presume what the participant might think if I asked them a question like, do you believe in God? Because right away I was going to have a problem with that, about what belief means, about what God means. So I asked some broader questions. And I was remembering when I did my research that Tauler said that very strongly. That the moment the researcher uses the term religion, we already go into a set of ready-made attitudes. Already people think about religion as, oh, you mean church. And already now we're in a problem. How do we break through to their own beliefs if already we're imposing some of our assumptions through the language that we're using? So what do I talk about? I don't ask people if they're religious. I ask them about morality. These are the three areas I think that comes out in most research and most of our theories about religion. I think they relate to morality. They relate to origins and endings. They relate to agency. So my questions are based on that, and I'll ask people those kinds of questions, like, what do you think is good or bad for you? And where do you get those beliefs from? I talk to them, and this is often where they will tell me stories about supernatural beliefs. So I talk about origins and endings, and I ask people questions like, what do you think happens after you die? And how do you think the universe came into being? I mean, these are, right, ontological existential questions I expect then. If they're going to talk about religion or the supernatural, that's probably where they're going to do it. And indeed, that is where they do it. And I found out all sorts of interesting things. Some I hadn't expected. So, for example, one of my questions was, what really scares you? And then the next question was, and what do you do with that when you're afraid? So what really scares you? I expected when I asked that question of 14 and 15-year-olds, I thought they were going to say they're afraid of dying. And I was very surprised that I didn't actually get much of that. What I did get was they're afraid that their parents were going to die, which, thinking about it, made more sense, right? Who was going to look after them? So in those kinds of discussions of origins and endings, where the universe come from, what happens after death, in those questions I often found people might start to talk about what we might call supernatural. So I didn't ask them directly, but over time I figure about a third of the people I talk to volunteer these stories. And most of them are agnostics or atheists. Now, Jonathan might have a view about this, but what I gather is that a lot of, certainly mainstream Christianity, disapproves of people seeing ghosts of their deceased relatives. I think there is something that people felt very embarrassed about, at least a lot of parish priests told me, that people would often say, I don't know if I should tell you this. Because there's a sense that for so many religious people, when you die, it's God's business now. It's God's business, not yours, to see this. But a lot of people were agnostics, a lot of them were atheists, and slightly more women than men. So what's the implication for this methodologically? Well, I think the implication is let's not force religious questions when we're trying to find out about religion. Let's not force supernatural questions when we're trying to find out about supernatural, because already we may be foreclosing some of the discussion. Now, I did come away from this slightly in my recent baby boomer research, where most of the people who volunteered, my sample was very clear. I wanted people in my research who were baby boomers, who were born 1940-ish, late onwards, till I sort of cut it off around 1960. I know that's maybe not what everybody would agree with, but that was the age band I found useful. I also wanted to talk to only those people who had gone to church when they were children, and specifically the Anglican Church, because this is the Church of England, it's also the Church of Canada, so I could have some cross-cultural comparison. I wanted those people who had gone to church, been baptized, and probably been confirmed, and then stopped going and were otherwise not religious. So that was a very tight sample. I tested it out with YouGov, a polling company in the UK, just to see how many people would actually fit that sort of criteria, and a lot of people did. So these are people who are no longer religious but had early childhood religion. And occasionally I did prompt them. I said, couching it in really uncertain terms, that, have you ever experienced anything, kind of odd, kind of uncanny? And then some people told me. And I suggest they tell me because it matters. And I suggest it matters because these beliefs are not neutral. They really mean things to people. Now, I did have some contradictions, I thought. For example, one of my early people, who was Patrick, he described himself as an atheist, and he was adamantly an atheist. He said, I don't believe there's any all-powerful force that's organizing human destiny. I think that's utterly ridiculous. So far, so good, right? That fits into some sort of Dawkins view of the atheist, hardcore, rational atheist, right? But then he went on and confounded me a bit. Because he said he believed in the human spirit. And I said, well, tell me about that. And he said, well, when my mother died, I was really devastated. We'd been very close. And I honestly didn't know what to do. He said he was so devastated that he couldn't even go to her funeral. And the morning of her funeral, he was in his home, and he was thinking, I can't do it. I just can't do it. When all of a sudden he felt, he told me, a sense of her presence. And he said it was very strong, very comforting, very peaceful. And he said so much so that I went to the funeral, and it was okay. And he said ever since then, I think there is something called the human spirit, something that connects us. Atheist believes in the human spirit. There was another atheist I interviewed, who again said he was an atheist, and told me there was nothing so illegal as the Catholic Church. He went on and on about it. He was very angry about religion. And then he told me about seeing a ghost one night. He was in his very old cottage, and he was alone in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and this figure walked by him and disappeared into the wall. Again, atheist? And I was very confused, because we don't usually see that as an atheist, do we? And actually that particular person was unusual because he talked about an impersonal ghost. Most of the people I interview talk about ghosts that are very personal. With the baby boomers. So I was talking to one man, and he told me that there was something he wanted to talk about. I didn't know quite how to describe it, so I just let him talk. And he said, describes his story. And he said he was an atheist and a humanist. And he said his son was very ill, and he was in a hospital. And this gentleman said to me he was beside the bed, and he was very worried about his son. And all of a sudden he felt his father's presence. He said it was like he had his hand on my shoulder. I felt it very strongly, that my father was there, and my father was saying to me, it's okay, everything will be okay. And it was okay. So he told me that story. I said, well, that's really interesting. And I said, so tell me, have you had any other supernatural experiences? And he said, I didn't say supernatural. I thought, rookie error. I had just imposed this word on him. He said, I didn't say supernatural. I said, no, I'm sorry, you didn't. You didn't. Okay, so have you had any other sort of experiences like that? And he said, yes. And he went and told me more stories about his father also appearing. So he really reacted against that word. He didn't want it to be called supernatural. He said it felt really natural. It felt just like he was there. What's supernatural about that? So what do we do with this? What do we do with what apparently is this contradiction, these humanists, these atheists who don't believe in God, but they believe in ghosts? And I suggest that's what we need to do, what we need to get to it methodologically, by opening up the ground for people to tell those stories. I don't think it's a contradiction, and here I'll go against some of the early anthropological theories. Tyler, who invented this idea and definition, that he said that religion was belief in spirits, and it was something that people would generally evolve out of. He said that in the 19th century. Michael Lambert, contemporary anthropologist, notes that the idea that religion is belief in spirits has a certain congeniality that still continues. However, we don't see that people have all of a sudden evolved out of it. So Tanya Lerman, for example, did her study in London and looked at modern witchcraft, as have others, Cush and Ezzy Berger and Graham Harvey, and to some extent me. And they look at modern witches, and they find that people still believe in spirits in that sense. And in particular, Lerman said, how will I define witchcraft? And she eventually defined it. And she said, witchcraft, she thought, was, and this is somebody who not only was an anthropological studying witches in London in 1990s, but also she became a witch in a technical sense. She said she was going to do all of it. And there's courses you take going through the different levels of being a witch. And she went through all those courses to do everything that they could do. But she said at the end she didn't think she was a witch because she couldn't believe in the central idea of witchcraft, which she defined as the belief that it is possible to affect material objects through non-material means. Okay, what do we mean by that? Well, we might mean that's casting a spell. A Christian might say it's saying a prayer. So affecting a material object through non-material means. And Lerman said, no, actually, I don't believe that. But some people do, and some people have continued to believe that. And the problem with Tyler's definition isn't just that he thought that people would evolve out of it, but it doesn't allow for the corollary. So if religion is belief in spirits, does that mean belief in spirits is always religion? What about belief in spirits as not religion? And also looking back on Tyler, and what do we mean by evolving out of it, that we become really smart and then we don't believe this stuff? Well, if we talk about supernatural, we talk about religion, there's a lot of smart people out there who are religious and who are supernatural believers. So it's too narrow an idea that someday in a sort of evolutionary way we'll all grow out of this. And it continues, and it's not disappearing. And it's not, I suggest, a contradiction. I think a contradiction is sometimes a pattern that we don't yet recognize. And so we call it a contradiction. Interestingly enough, to our research participants, it's not a contradiction. They think it's perfectly normal. We're the ones saying, this doesn't quite fit a pre-existing category. The problem is language. What do we do with this? Because when people talk in my studies, when people talk about this, and I read other people's studies, they don't use words like supernatural. And as we just saw, with that baby boomer example, they don't even like words. What are their words they use? Well, the words are personal words. They talk about feeling their mom, or their dad, or their nan, or their granddad. You know, they don't say, I would like to talk to you about an extraordinary supernatural experience I had. They said, I want to talk to you about what it felt like when I felt like my mom was there. So this is a coding problem. Ayana was talking about that yesterday. I mean, how do you code this stuff? And what do you say? And Look, I've got all sorts of language out there I've tried, and I don't think any of it is any good. I tried extraordinary relationality. That sounded pretty good. Doesn't kind of catch on though, does it? I tried to talk about the secular supernatural. Okay, I think my colleagues understood. Continuing bonds is what we talk about in anthropology. I thought this was really clever, but again, it doesn't kind of roll off the tongue, does it? Social, sensuous, supernatural. Why? Because it is social, it's really embodied, it is supernatural, but these are inadequate. So I turn this over to you, problem, because you're more used to this than I am, trying to find a language to do your questionnaires with. I don't find any of it satisfactory, and I certainly don't find it used by my research participants. But I do find that there's something in common they have. And so when I analyze the sort of data that I come up with, I find that there are certain characteristics that seem to be shared amongst people. So my question changed then from what is this to really how is this? So how is it happening? And there's a few characteristics. First of all, it does seem that people who sense the presence of their deceased relatives are sensing it in a way that exists as the same relationship that they had before. And I found that in particular once with a couple. Oddly enough, I had interviewed a couple. I usually interview individuals, on their own. But this was a married couple I interviewed together. And they talked about this situation one night when they didn't believe in God. They told me that. But then they stopped and said, but there was something funny. And so they told me this story. The man's father had died about 2 weeks earlier. And what happened, they said, was they were in bed at night, 2 in the morning, and they're fast asleep. Had a 2-bedroom house, and on top of the stairs was their bedroom and their spare bedroom. And in their spare bedroom, they had their father's clothes, his father's clothes, that they'd put out because they were going to take him to a charity shop the next day. And they then woke up with the sound of very heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. And they both froze, apparently, and thought somebody is coming, this is an intruder. And then the footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. Nothing happened. So the man got out of bed and went out and looked, nobody there. Went downstairs, nothing. Door closed, windows closed. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, I think it was my father coming to look for his clothes. He was a very angry man, and he sounded angry on the stairs. So I thought, okay, same relationship that he had in life was repeated. Same relationship. And so when people tell me about being comforted by their deceased relative, it is usually the sense of relief and comfort that they felt while that person was alive. So it's a continuity of their relationship that seems to be important. And it's embodied, and this is why I call it the social, sensuous, supernatural. And there's methodological implications for this I'll come back to soon. And so in general, I found, and thinking very anthropologically, looking for functions, I found that, yes, there did seem to be a shared function of these entities, that they had this sense of something as either a comforter or a protector or a portender in some cases, looking at something in the future, and a social binder looking at and creating some kind of cohesion. But it was very striking to me how these experiences were embodied, how they were material to the people that I talked to. That it seemed to be that these presences were located and embodied, and some people talked about seeing something, some people smelling something, some person talked about smelling her father's cigarettes, another person talked about a perfume, hearing things, sometimes touch. Very rarely do people talk to me about touch. One only I can remember, a woman who said she was missing her friend who had died, and they were very, very close. And she said, but sometimes I feel like she's almost coming up behind me and stopping. And she said, do you know the feeling? Sometimes when people stand right close to you and you can sort of feel a bit of a presence, a tingle. She said, I sometimes feel that. But what are they saying here? They're saying that they have some experience and something that's non-human, or we might say other than human, but definitely social. It was their embodied relational activity that they are experiencing again. So for example, these are some often non-human, what they see. There was an example of a funeral that had occurred, and the young man had died, and the young man's grandmother told me that the night of the funeral, that they looked out and they saw incredible sunset. And she said she and her daughter looked at the sunset and thought, that's him. That's him saying he's okay. They were convinced that. Another woman had been with her sister at their son's grave, just tidying it up, putting some candles, and they looked over and they saw a candle nearby, and it was a light. And she said, I asked my sister, did you see that before? She said, no. So, what happened? The candle had become lit in their view. So these comforters, these protectors, these portentors, Bryony, not religious, 19 years old, told me after she tried to commit suicide that when she woke up in hospital, she felt her grandmother there, protecting her, and she still does. She said, years later, I still feel my grandmother protecting me. Charlotte was only 14, and she said, well, I don't know if God exists or not, but it doesn't interfere. My granddad does. And she talked about her deceased grandfather and how she felt really bad about being bullied. And then one day the bullying stopped, and she said it was because my granddad went and told them to stop. So that's her protector. Lynn was telling me that her grandfather also protected her. And I just want to repeat this story because there is something in her language, again, I think is very important. She told me that she had once fallen downstairs carrying a glass. And as she fell down, we watched her and thought, oh no, the glass is going to break and she's going to cut herself. And she said, but it didn't happen. I got to the end of the stairs, glass hadn't broken, I was fine. I stood up, I was fine. She said, my grandfather protected me. I thought, where did that come from? It was to her just the only rational explanation. She had another example about being on a bus and standing there, not being able to hold on because she was carrying too many things, and the bus took off suddenly. And she said she should have fallen, but she didn't, because her grandfather caught her. And so not only was the grandfather a protector, but she said to me, how else could you explain that? She asked me, how else could you explain that? How else could you explain that she didn't hurt herself? So for her, the only rational explanation that defied the law of physics in this case would be that her grandfather had protected her. Some people talk about feeling that something was going to happen. Becca told me about the night that her brother died in a traffic accident, and there was a terrible storm. It was such a terrible storm, and she felt that was a storm that was telling them that her brother had been killed in a car accident, and it was her brother coming to tell her. Viv talked about smelling her mother's favorite flower just before her aunt died. There were no flowers in the room. She was suddenly overwhelmed with this flower. That was her mom, she said, coming to tell her that her aunt died. So all of these are the stories I get a lot, that this benign sense that somebody is looking after people beyond now, beyond here, and sometimes being embodied and felt through physical means, through the comfort, through the protector, through the portent. And then there became a problem. These stories, these belief narratives, these open-ended stories, as Emily Burdett was talking about yesterday, open-ended stories. They told me about these stories. They would bring up these stories in their interviews, and they sounded really rehearsrsed. They sounded like they're really repetitive. And I can remember doing my PhD first and coming up with these stories and saying to some of my colleagues, yeah, I mean, they all had them really kind of down pat. And somebody said, oh, that's too bad then, isn't it? They'd rehearsed them. It's too bad. It's like they weren't so authentic. And I thought for a minute, yeah, too bad. And they went, wait a minute. Why is that not authentic? Why is it not authentic? They tell this story all the time. Of course they do. They want to tell the story over and over again. So I began to try to work out, why do people want to tell the story? Why do they want to repeat the story? I suggest because it's performative. I suggest, following Austin, following Butler, that there are some ways and some times that people use their beliefs and belief in the supernatural, let's say, to bring something into being, to make something happen. And so what are they doing? What are they trying to make happen? And I suggest one of the things they're trying to make happen is they're trying to sustain the memory of their deceased relative, and that's why they tell us the story all the time. It reminds me of an expression that people die a second death when their name is no longer spoken. In this case, people are keeping alive to them their deceased relatives. The stories are social because I hear them and they are polyvocal. Often people are introducing other people in the accounts. So we is often something people say. So Becca and her mother, we had that thunderstorm experience. Madge and her daughter, we saw the sunset. Liz and her sister saw the candles. And this has been through other people's research as well. Vitebsky, who was talking about his research in Siberia, and he talked about how one woman recounted this. that there had been a man appearing in the dreams of all of our relatives. All of our relatives are having the same dream. So there's a sense in some way that these are of different voices and they're shared by people. And so therefore to analyze this in terms of method, this is what I tried to do. I tried to break down these stories. And I tried to look at them, not just with the content, which is usually where people stop. Let's analyze what people said. Let's look at the content. Well, I look at that. But also I ask people, well, what does that matter? How do you put this into practice? And where do you think you got those beliefs from? And how important are they? Where are they important? And how do they function? What do they do? And in what time and in what place? And that's very, very important that we remember the context always. I was thinking what Conrad said. Is this religion or is this superstition? Well, doesn't it depend who's saying that, at what time? So I think methodologically to look at this is to break down when these arise, when these experiences of supernatural arises, when these beliefs in religion or supernatural arise. When do they arise? How do they arise? Where do people get those beliefs from? Where do they think they originated? And what I find a lot of the time is that we're talking about social acts. We're talking about acts of care. Said Bryony, thinking about her grandmother who always protects her. She says she goes into a church, wherever she is, she lights the candle in remembering. Lighting the candle in the grave. In Norway, the practice of lighting candles has increased. So these acts of care, I suggest, are examples of how beliefs in this sort of supernatural are performing the same function as what used to be called ancestor worship. Okay, so when people studied ancestor worship, what did they find it was? They found that ancestor worship was a way of maintaining certain things. It maintained a name, it maintained a lineage, it sustained social bonds, it reproduced certain values, it reproduced certain social structures. I think that's what's happening when people talk about their beliefs in their returning, in some way, relatives. I think what we're seeing is a modern form of ancestor worship, very much situated in labor, very much situated within care, tending for graves, candles, telling stories, keeping them alive. So there's a number of conclusions I want to put out there that may or may not make sense or may be useful in further research. So first of all, I think we have to think that these supernatural or afterlife experiences, this continuity of the human soul, are not to most people abstract. They really mean something very particular. And I think what they mean often is ideas about their presence of relatives. They're not just abstract ideas about heaven or hell. When people talk about being in heaven, to me, when we're talking about that, they're not saying the Christian form of heaven. They're just trying to struggle for a word that means after death. And for a lot of people, that's what heaven is. It's a place after death. I think also a conclusion is that these beliefs are relational. When people talk about them, they very much don't talk about them in the abstract. They talk about them being performative, being acts, and being supported by social relationships. And so we have to ask them, like Conrad did yesterday, well, how are they produced? I think overwhelmingly in my research, they are produced empirically. That people talk about examples. I don't know, you will tell me how you reproduce this in a lab or some other psychological experiment. But this is important to people, I think, is that it's the lived experience that people talk about. Their lived experience of sensing the presence of their deceased relatives. They don't try to explain it. Goodness knows I've asked them. What do you make of that? How do you explain that? What do you think of that? And they say, well, I don't know. I don't know. They are not like us, right? They're not searching for a theory to explain it. They don't need to do that. And I found that very frustrating when I first started my research. I kind of wanted them to give me an explanation. They don't care about the explanation. My recent research with baby boomers, again, they don't care. They might go as far as saying, well, I don't know. Science might explain one day. Maybe we'll figure out one day. That there's some particles that hang around, I don't know. Maybe mediums are like super sensitive in some ways, I don't know. It doesn't trouble them, that's what I'm saying. It doesn't trouble them that they are searching for an explanation. Most of them, the experience is enough. So what do we also need to know about that? I think it's a dynamic. I think we're looking at things that many people find ordinary. We might describe as extraordinary. I think rooted in some kind of relational experience. If that's helpful, there's some further reading if you want to do any of that. I will leave that up there. So how to research belief without asking questions. An open access paper. John talked about the ARDA being open access. David and I contributed this some years ago. Talks about these categories. It talks about the categories of non-religious belief. And the edited collection I've just done about diversity and inclusion and decolonization, and recently about baby boomers and how they shaped belief and belonging, because of course it was the baby boomers that raised the millennials, right? Who are the least generation ever. So we want to find out what happened with those baby boomers who left religion and raised non-religious children. So those are my contributions, and I would be, as always, interested in your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, John has a question.
So I have a question about, well, first, all this confirms this totally unjustified until today theory I have about how all religion really is ancestor worship developed into something else, but never mind. So my question is about how much ambivalence you saw in people's expressions about these experiences. And okay, so what I mean by that is one or both of two things. So one comes from something that Jesse Bering says about his own experiences after his mother died. So his mother dies, and then on the day of her funeral, I think, he hears the wind chimes outside the window, and he immediately thinks to himself, that's my mother. And then he immediately shuts that down and goes, oh, well, that can't be my mother. Obviously, I don't believe in afterlife. My mother's dead. That can't be her. So for him, there was this kind of like double-mindedness, right? His intuitions were that's his mother, and then he sort of genuinely, right, just for a moment believes that, but then also, right, something else kicks in. He goes, what? That can't be right. So that's one version of ambivalence. The second comes from my own mother, which is when I was small. So I grew up in a context where we did ancestor worship. So I will ask my mother, well, you know, like we're burning these bits of paper, right? Like paper Ferraris and iPads and shirts and money and all the rest of it. Like, why do we do that, right? Like, you know, does great grandpa really get these things in the afterlife? And she would say, of course, that's why we do it, right? You know, we burn the thing and then that's how it works. But then I would probe further, go, but yeah, but that doesn't make sense, right? Like the car is made of paper. And then after some pestering, she would say, like, look, of course, he doesn't get a Ferrari in the afterlife, right? Like the point is we gather around the thing and we tell stories about great grandpa, and so there, like, and I don't know what she believes, right? Because at one level, right, she insists that yeah, that's how it works. You burn the thing and then they get it. Like it's very simple. On the other hand, upon some pestering, right, she will say no, like that's not the point. The point is the memory thing, which you ended with. Do you see that kind of one or both of that kind of double-mindedness at all in these narratives that people give, where they will express the belief of the experience and then they will then kind of secularize the experience later on upon some probing?
Not so much, Jonathan. I think it's because I don't ask a direct question about it. People want to tell me, right? Yeah. So it comes with that already on the table, if you like putting on the table something that really is important to them. So they're not so much introducing it as something they're questioning. They want to tell me about it because they want to believe. I tried to have a subtitle once, but it's just too cute. Believing in bereaving, right? You know, a lot of people really want that to mean something. When I do find the ambivalence, and it's interesting, I found the ambivalence with people who hadn't experienced it themselves, but someone they knew had experienced it. And so they sometimes offered those stories. As one guy said to me, they were staying at her parents' house, and in the middle of the night, this woman jumped out of bed and ran out, looked out the window and said, my God, my father's car is there. They were supposed to be away on holiday. So he went outside, and he didn't see anything. And she said, no, I saw my father's car. And then he told me that night, her father had died in a car accident before she had seen the car. So he said to me, I don't know what that means. You know, I can't explain it. So in a way, he's being a little ambivalent. But what I found when people were being ambivalent in their accounts of other people, they were also being profoundly respectful of those accounts and saying, well, you know, I don't get it, but this is what happened to so-and-so. But no, for the most part, because I don't ask a direct question and they volunteer these stories, there's less ambivalence, I think, because they want to tell me.
Yeah. I just want to offer an anecdotum. Right, as you know, nobody goes to church anymore, blah, blah, blah. All Souls Day and Remembrance Sunday are surprisingly well attended. I mean, Remembrance Sunday not so surprisingly well attended because that's like a national thing, right? But All Souls Day, which I've just introduced it to the parish, and some of my other clergy friends tell me the same thing when they've introduced All Souls Day. People who'd never come, and sometimes not even on Christmas, right, and Easter, will come for All Souls Day, and like so something interesting is going on about death, I think.
It's interesting you've introduced it because I had thought I've seen these pop up more recently. So why do you think you have introduced it?
I'm like obsessed about death, right? Like my PhD was on the fear of death, blah blah blah. But I think you're right that it's come back a bit more, and I don't know. I think there must be intuition among the clergy that there is kind of some vague sense of spirituality surrounding death because we see it in the numbers about like funerals and people don't get their kids baptized anymore, really. People don't really get married in churches anymore. The funeral numbers have declined too. The church funerals have declined too. But in some ways, that's misleading because
it's an older generation.
Well, it's not just that. It's that there are lots of people now who want the cleric to be at the crematorium. So church funerals have declined, like precipitously. But that hides the church involvement in crematorium funerals. Like, we're still at crematoria all the time. We hate it because it's a 25-minute slot in a really ugly building, right? But like, I think the intuition among clergy is that even though a lot of these like life, these markings of different life stages, the wedding part and the baptism part has kind of like gone by the wayside. The death part has still more or less maintained. We're still doing lots and lots of funerals, just not at church.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. I did my PhD about experience narratives, personal experience narratives in northern Slovakia, and one thing I recognized early in my fieldwork, and many folklorists mentioned that as well, that when you ask people about beliefs, they don't tell you beliefs, they tell you narratives. And this doesn't mean that they don't have beliefs, like abstract ideas, but these are embedded in narratives. Mm-hmm. And this actually defines the beliefs they have, because you have narratives, and if you ask about some actors in the narratives, the role they play in the narrative, this defines what you think. But when I asked them, they told me a story, and then I asked them, but what is this spirit or this soul or whatever it was? So I could infer from how they reacted that this was the first time they ever thought about it in this way. Usually I got a repertoire of narratives, like what is this? And they told me stories of their parents, their personal experience, etc., etc. So, and these were not these kind of official religions, supernatural beliefs, but some kind of folks' beliefs and experiences with ancestors, etc. So I think this is kind of, and cognitive narratologists actually claim that narratives or stories are the way how we represent reality. So it's kind of natural that the beliefs are embedded in narratives. So
yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And I think when we analyze interview data, we have to keep that in mind. I once interviewed two young boys together, and they were talking to me about things, and I was recording it. And they went on and on about fishing, how they love fishing together. And so when I got home and I was transcribing this, I remembered saying to myself, oh man, they went on about fishing for 10 minutes. And I was trying to transcribe it, and oh gosh, there's an uncle's fishing line and this thing and this thing. And it was so detailed about fishing, and I nearly said to myself, I'm going to skip over this and not bother transcribing it in detail. I don't need to know more about fishing. And then it really occurred to me, they weren't talking about fishing. They were talking about friendship. And I had to listen to that. And so what were people saying when they're talking about their narrative? What is the detail that their fabric of their life and their everyday experience is saying? And I think that's what we sometimes have to try to get underneath. Yeah.
Okay. Let me tell you a narrative, right? Just recently, it was All Souls Day, right? And in Poland, as in Norway, the tradition is that you go to your family graves and you put candles on there. right? And it just so happens that that's exactly what I do. And it also happens to be one of the holidays in Poland that I actually like a lot. And what I do is, when I'm at these graves, is I like to talk about the people who are buried there. But here's the thing. The stories I like to talk about are the stories from when they were alive. That's how I remember them. So my question is, why do people tell these stories from after those people were alive to remember them, rather than remembering stories from when they were alive, which would seem to be the more natural, to borrow a word, thing?
Well, I think they do. I think when they talk about their mother or their grandmother, they're talking about the relationship they had with them when they were alive. You know, my mother was always looking after, my grandmother was always there, my grandmother would always look after me. So I'm not sure if that's what you mean, but
I mean, you know, you've told us about all these stories about, you know, how this person was falling down the stairs and they were saved by the grandfather,
right. Yeah.
who had been dead for many years, and how they were, you know, saved on the bus by the same grandfather who again had been dead for many, many years.
And I think
why those stories?
I think it depends which. I identify 3 areas I think that come up, and one of those was the protector.
Yeah.
And so the protector comes up very much in terms of their, you know, real now experience. I think mostly when they talk about their ancestors, in terms of their comfort, they're talking about their relationship that they had before, and that's when I would expect to hear those stories. But it depends on whether or not we think at the time, what are they experiencing, and that's perhaps a little different than your experience, because you're going through your ritual of going to your grave in order to do that. The people that I'm talking about are people who want to tell me about a story that a feeling they had, an experience they had, that arose to them, that they felt had happened to them. So they didn't go to church to experience it. It happened one day when they were walking along. It happened one day when they were in their car. So it was like, it kind of appears out of nowhere to a lot of people, that they didn't presume it was going to happen. And maybe that's why those stories are literally in that kind of immediate, they saved my life, or they were here talking to me.
All right, I mean, this makes me think of, I suppose in a way, the kind of things that Pascal Boyer talks about, how these stories break what is our intuitive understanding of the world, and therefore they are highly memorable and also likely to be, people want to tell them to others. Do you think that's a big part of what's going on here?
I think it's always extraordinary. That's why I try to once have that expression, extraordinary relationality, because it's always extraordinary, and that's what they want to tell. And often they interrupt the interview to tell me this, and sometimes precede it with language like, you know, have you ever, often they say to me, have you ever experienced anything? And I'll go sort of hedge my bets for a bit, well, maybe. And they go, well, because, and they want to tell me about it. And they want to tell me in a sense that it, to them, was transformative, experiential, and also in many ways to them it was unbidden. They hadn't expected this to happen. So that sense of their surprise, they hadn't turned up to an experience with their preformed idea that it was going to happen. And I think that colors a lot of the reasons they want to tell me, was because it, to them, appeared out of nowhere. And that to them is the extraordinary part of it, that it wasn't just them thinking about remembering. Although a colleague of mine, Sylvia Collins-Mayo, was talking about this, and she was saying that she does find a lot of this happens when young people go to bed at night to say their prayers. And they go, but they don't say their prayers to God. They say their prayers to their deceased relatives. And I have found some of the people, young people I interviewed did that. They said that they went and they didn't pray to God, they prayed to their grandfather.
So every church in Church of England after the Queen died has a book of remembrance, right? And reading through it has been extremely interesting, because some people obviously just, you know, are writing to me, I suppose, saying, you know, telling me stories about the Queen. But like a significant proportion of these things look like they're talking to the dead Queen, right? They're effectively prayers addressed to the Queen. I mean, I have no idea who writes these things, right? Because none of these people are people who come to church regularly. They're just kind of people who live in the village. But yeah, so I see this not only with people praying to their dead ancestors, but these were literally messages addressed to Her Majesty the Queen, whom they don't know, obviously, but they're addressed to her. They're writing to her in quite personal terms. So this interesting sense of like praying to the dead, but in this case, the royal dead, I suppose.
One of the other experiences I didn't relate to through my own empirical research, but I was supervising a young woman's master's program, and her dissertation she took was, I don't know if you saw the documentary, it's called The Phone of the Wind.
Yeah.
Okay, so in Japan after the tsunami, somebody actually put a phone box up on a piece of land overlooking some of the terribly damaged parts, and there was a phone in it. And people come and pick up the phone and address their deceased relatives, the ones who were killed in the tsunami. And so there seems like people who, as the documentary was saying, they weren't otherwise religious, but they had this need to talk directly to their relatives, often very angrily. You know, why did you leave me? What happened? But there's this need to address them. Jonathan, you know, I just want to ask you, I've seen this in a lot of churches, Church of England churches, where there'll be the areas with the candles, and sometimes it's a card. And it says, it's okay to light a candle. This is not a representation of superstition or pagan belief. It's like the church has to explain this.
That's interesting. Like in the Church of England, my experience of it is on the very Catholic end, and like we're not that worried about people being superstitious, I think, right? So I would never warn anybody about that kind of thing. But that is the bit of the church that's used the most. Right, at least where I am, and actually that was true in my previous parish as well. I mean, there's wax everywhere all the time because people are constantly lighting candles. And for a church where on a Sunday morning, like 17 people will turn up, this is very surprising that it's so well used. And actually, the prayer box where people write, you know, sort of write what they are asking God for, a good proportion of them are about death as well, about their deceased loved ones, etc. And actually, come think of it. So I do a monthly Requiem Mass as well as an annual All Souls Mass. And the number of people who write to me saying, can you remember so-and-so? And they don't come to the service, right? So and they don't go to any service, so they're not religious in that sense. But then they want me to remember their dead on their behalf. And that's, I don't really know what's going on there, but there's some kind of sense that, right, I have the power to intercede on behalf of the souls of their dead loved ones, even though they presumably don't believe, I don't know if they believe in God, right? Like I doubt it, I guess, given the statistics. And they certainly don't come to church, but there's still this sense in which they think that it's a good thing to do for the priest to remember their dead.
Yep, I did that myself when my father died. I was in England, living in a small village. He died in Canada. And I phoned up the village priest. I didn't go to church, but I knew him. And I said, I'm going to turn up tomorrow morning, Sunday, and please say a prayer. And I went, and I thought to myself, oh, I'm doing it because my dad would like it. But no, I liked it too, right? Yeah. I wanted there to be some sort of semi-public affirmation.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
We better get on to the next talk.